3 days after my wife passed away, my son suddenly quit his job. Why should I keep working? Mom's inheritance is enough for this whole family. And he didn't stop there. He turned to his wife and said, "I'll buy you a house by the ocean," then casually promised his mother-in-law $400,000. I didn't argue. I stayed quiet and let them keep planning how they would spend the money. Then the estate lawyer called me with shocking news that was about to turn all their plans upside down. Thank you so much for joining Dad's Revenge Stories today. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know your country or hometown in the comments. Please note, this story includes dramatized elements for educational and creative purposes. Any similarity to actual persons or locations is purely coincidental, yet the life message is deeply meaningful. 3 days after my wife took her last breath, my son walked into the kitchen at 9 in the morning wearing sweatpants and a faded Sacramento Kings t-shirt, poured himself a full mug of coffee, and sat down at the table like it was any other Saturday. I was standing at the counter with my own mug, the one Linda had bought me at a roadside shop in Oregon the summer we drove the coast without a single reservation. 42 years of mornings together, and I had never once had to teach myself how to hold a coffee cup. That morning, I had to remind my fingers to close around the handle. Daniel scrolled through his phone. He did not look up. "You're not at work," I said. He glanced at the clock above the stove, then back at his screen. "It's Monday, Dad. I know what day it is." He set his phone face down on the table the way he always did when he wanted me to think I had his full attention. "I took some personal days," I nodded. Linda's obituary was open on my laptop in the next room. The florist was calling back to confirm the arrangement for Friday's service. There were sympathy cards already stacked on the hallway table. Carol from next door had brought 3 because she said one never felt like enough. I had not eaten a real meal since Sunday afternoon, when Linda was still breathing, when the hospice nurse had quietly told me it would not be long now. I looked at my son across the kitchen. He was 38 years old. He had his mother's jaw and my stubborn streak, and for the first 30 years of his life, those two things together had made him someone I was proud of. He had worked his way up from an entry-level position at a logistics company to regional operations manager. He coached Brandon's Little League team on Saturday mornings. He called Linda every Sunday without fail, even during the years when he and I were not calling each other. "How many personal days?" I asked. Daniel wrapped both hands around his mug. He had a way of pausing before he answered a question he did not want to answer, a half second, barely long enough to notice, but I had been noticing it since he was 12 years old and trying to explain a dent in the garage door. "I didn't take personal days," he said. "I put in my resignation." I set my mug down on the counter. "You resigned yesterday morning." He said it the way someone announces they have switched phone carriers. Factual. Done. "Daniel." I heard my own voice come out quieter than I intended. "Your mother died Sunday night." "I know when Mom died, Dad." "You resigned Monday morning." He looked up then, and I saw something in his face that I did not recognize at first. Not guilt, not grief, but a kind of impatience, the expression of a man who has already had this argument in his head and won it. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said. "The timing isn't ideal, but the decision isn't about the timing." My chest tightened, the way it had when the hospice nurse had pulled me aside 3 weeks earlier and used the word weeks instead of months. That particular kind of tightening, the kind that starts behind your sternum and moves up into your throat, was one I had hoped never to feel again so soon. "Then what is it about?" I asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He looked out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree Linda had planted the year Brandon was born, at the October sky coming in pale and thin over the fence line. Then he looked back at me with the expression of a man delivering news he considers good. "Why would I keep working?" he said. "Mom's money is enough for all of us now." The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. The coffee in my mug had gone lukewarm without me noticing. I looked at my son, this man I had driven to Little League and argued with about curfews, and watched walk across a stage in a cap and gown, while Linda cried into a paper program she had folded into thirds, and I tried to find the version of him I recognized somewhere inside the one sitting across from me. "Your mother's money," I said slowly. "Come on, Dad. You know what I mean. The estate." He picked his phone back up, casual, like the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. "We don't have to figure everything out today. There's time. There is time." That was what he said. 3 days after Linda Hayes spent her last night on this earth, our son sat in her kitchen and told me there was time, as though time were something we had been short on before and were suddenly flush with now. I did not answer him. I picked up my mug, walked to the sink, and poured the rest of my coffee out. Then I rinsed the mug, set it in the drying rack, and dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. The dish towel Linda had embroidered with small yellow sunflowers. The winter her hands were still steady enough for that kind of work. "I'm going to call the florist," I said. I walked out of the kitchen without looking back at him. But I stopped in the hallway just outside the doorway where he could not see me. I stood there with one hand pressed flat against the wall and breathed through my nose the way the doctor had told me to when my blood pressure ran high. Linda had said something to me 3 weeks earlier in the quiet hour after the night nurse had come and gone. She had reached over and found my hand in the dark, and she had said, "When Alan calls, go alone. Promise me you'll go alone." Alan Porter, her estate attorney. I had promised without asking, why the way you promise things to someone whose time is measured in weeks, because the asking feels selfish and the promising costs you nothing in the moment. Standing in that hallway listening to Daniel scroll through his phone in the kitchen behind me, I finally understood that it had not cost me nothing. It had cost Linda something. She had spent some of her remaining energy making sure I would be alone in that room when I heard whatever Alan Porter had to say. I just did not yet know what that was. By 9 that evening, the house had gone quiet in the particular way houses go quiet, after people have spent the day avoiding each other. Daniel had retreated to the guest room sometime after lunch. I had spent most of the afternoon on the phone with the funeral home, then with the florist, then with Linda's sister in Portland, who cried so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear just to get through my own sentences. Carol brought over a casserole around 6. She set it on the counter, squeezed my hand without saying anything unnecessary, and left before I could feel obligated to make conversation. That was Carol's particular gift. She always seemed to understand that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is take up as little space as possible. I ate half a plate standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard. The oak tree Linda had planted was losing its leaves early this year. She had noticed it back in September and said it meant a cold winter. I had told her the tree was fine. I was wrong about a lot of things that fall. I was rinsing my plate when I heard Daniel's voice coming from the guest room down the hall. He was on the phone. I was not trying to listen. The walls in that part of the house had always been thinner than I would have liked. A fact Linda and I had discovered the hard way when Daniel was a teenager. I turned off the faucet and stood still. "Jess, listen to me." His voice was low but not quiet enough. "I'm telling you, we don't have to wait much longer. This is actually happening." I set the plate in the drying rack. "The beach house." A pause. "Santa Barbara. We always talked about it. Baby, we can actually do this now." Another pause, longer. Then a laugh, easy, relaxed, the kind of laugh that belongs to a man who believes his problems have just been solved. I know. I know. Just trust me. I walked to the hallway and stood outside the guest room door. I did not knock. I did not push the door open. I stood there with my back against the wall and my arms crossed over my chest, because some part of me needed to hear the rest of it before I decided what to do with what I was hearing. The call with Jessica ended. 30 seconds later, Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He picked up immediately. Margaret. His voice shifted warmer now, the careful warmth of a man performing generosity for an audience. How are you holding up? I know. It's been a hard few days for all of us. Margaret Saunders, Jessica's mother. A widow who lived alone down in Fresno in a small house with a leaky roof she had mentioned twice at Thanksgiving dinner last year. Listen, I've been thinking, Daniel said. Once everything clears, and it's going to be soon, I promise I want to take care of that debt situation you've been dealing with. All of it. A pause. No, I mean it. $400,000, Margaret. Clean slate. You don't have to worry about that anymore. $400,000. I pressed the back of my head against the wall and stared at the ceiling. The water stain up there in the corner, Linda had been after me to fix the roof above it for 3 years. I had kept saying next weekend, until next weekend became something neither of us had anymore. Daniel kept talking. He was telling Margaret not to mention it to anyone yet, that these things took a little time to process through the estate, but that she should consider it done. His voice had the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether the money in his account would cover what he just promised. Except the money was not in his account. It was not in any account he had access to. It was Linda's, built across 40 years of my wife getting up before sunrise to pack school lunches and clip grocery coupons and drive carpool routes and sit across from insurance agents and financial advisors and make careful, unglamorous decisions about a future she turned out not to live long enough to spend. I pushed off the wall and walked back to the kitchen. I stood in front of Linda's chair, the one at the head of the table, the one she had claimed 12 years ago when her back started bothering her and the chair nearest the window had better light for reading. I pulled it out and sat down in it. I had never sat in that chair before. It felt wrong in a way I could not entirely explain, the way wearing someone else's coat feels wrong even when it fits. I sat there anyway. On the table in front of me was the stack of sympathy cards Carol had brought. On top was one with a watercolor lighthouse on the front. Linda had always liked lighthouses. She said they were the most honest structures ever built because their entire purpose was to warn you away from the rocks. From down the hall, I heard Daniel laugh again at something Margaret said. That easy, certain laugh. My hands were flat on the table. I looked down at them, the left one with the wedding band I had worn for so long that the skin beneath it was a slightly different color. The knuckles on the right were rough from 40 years of working with wood, of pushing grain, and learning patience from material that had no interest in being rushed. Linda had held these hands in the ICU 2 nights ago. She had held them and pressed her thumb slowly across my knuckles over and over, which was its own kind of language between people who have shared a bed for 4 decades. I was still sitting in her chair when Daniel came out of the guest room 20 minutes later and stopped short in the kitchen doorway. Dad. He looked uncertain for the first time all day. You okay? I looked up at him. My son. 38 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway in his socks, holding his phone with $400,000 of his mother's money already spoken for, and a beach house already half built in his imagination. Go to bed, Daniel, I said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded once and went back down the hall. I stayed in Linda's chair until the clock on the microwave read 11:42. Then I got up, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to the bedroom alone. By 9 that evening, the house had gone quiet, in the particular way houses go quiet, after people have spent the day avoiding each other. Daniel had retreated to the guest room sometime after lunch. I had spent most of the afternoon on the phone with the funeral home then, with the florist. Then with Linda's sister in Portland, who cried so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear just to get through my own sentences. Carol brought over a casserole around 6. She set it on the counter, squeezed my hand without saying anything unnecessary, and left before I could feel obligated to make conversation. That was Carol's particular gift. She always seemed to understand that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is take up as little space as possible. I ate half a plate standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard. The oak tree Linda had planted was losing its leaves early this year. She had noticed it back in September and said it meant a cold winter. I had told her the tree was fine. I was wrong about a lot of things that fall. I was rinsing my plate when I heard Daniel's voice coming from the guest room down the hall. He was on the phone. I was not trying to listen. The walls in that part of the house had always been thinner than I would have liked. A fact Linda and I had discovered the hard way when Daniel was a teenager. I turned off the faucet and stood still. Jess listened to me. His voice was low but not quiet enough. I'm telling you, we don't have to wait much longer. This is actually happening. I set the plate in the drying rack. The beach house. A pause. Santa Barbara. We always talked about it. Baby, we can actually do this now. Another pause longer. Then a laugh, easy, relaxed, the kind of laugh that belongs to a man who believes his problems have just been solved. I know. Just trust me. I walked to the hallway and stood outside the guest room door. I did not knock. I did not push the door open. I stood there with my back against the wall and my arms crossed over my chest, because some part of me needed to hear the rest of it before I decided what to do with what I was hearing. The call with Jessica ended. 30 seconds later, Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He picked up immediately. Margaret. His voice shifted warmer now, the careful warmth of a man performing generosity for an audience. How are you holding up? I know. It's been a hard few days for all of us. Margaret Saunders, Jessica's mother. A widow who lived alone down in Fresno in a small house with a leaky roof she had mentioned twice at Thanksgiving dinner last year. Listen, I've been thinking, Daniel said. Once everything clears, and it's going to be soon, I promise I want to take care of that debt situation you've been dealing with. All of it. A pause. No, I mean it. $400,000, Margaret. Clean slate. You don't have to worry about that anymore. $400,000. I pressed the back of my head against the wall and stared at the ceiling. The water stain up there in the corner, Linda had been after me to fix the roof above it for 3 years. I had kept saying next weekend, until next weekend became something neither of us had anymore. Daniel kept talking. He was telling Margaret not to mention it to anyone yet, that these things took a little time to process through the estate, but that she should consider it done. His voice had the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether the money in his account would cover what he just promised. Except the money was not in his account. It was not in any account he had access to. It was Linda's, built across 40 years of my wife getting up before sunrise to pack school lunches and clip grocery coupons and drive carpool routes and sit across from insurance agents and financial advisors and make careful, unglamorous decisions about a future she turned out not to live long enough to spend. I pushed off the wall and walked back to the kitchen. I stood in front of Linda's chair, the one at the head of the table, the one she had claimed 12 years ago when her back started bothering her, and the chair nearest the window had better light for reading. I pulled it out and sat down in it. I had never sat in that chair before. It felt wrong in a way I could not entirely explain, the way wearing someone else's coat feels wrong even when it fits. I sat there anyway. On the table in front of me was the stack of sympathy cards Carol had brought. On top was one with a watercolor lighthouse on the front. Linda had always liked lighthouses. She said they were the most honest structures ever built because their entire purpose was to warn you away from the rocks. From down the hall, I heard Daniel laugh again at something Margaret said. That easy, certain laugh. My hands were flat on the table. I looked down at them, the left one with the wedding band I had worn for so long that the skin beneath it was a slightly different color. The knuckles on the right were rough from 40 years of working with wood, of pushing grain, and learning patience from material that had no interest in being rushed. Linda had held these hands in the ICU 2 nights ago. She had held them and pressed her thumb slowly across my knuckles over and over, which was its own kind of language between people who have shared a bed for 4 decades. I was still sitting in her chair when Daniel came out of the guest room 20 minutes later and stopped short in the kitchen doorway. Dad. He looked uncertain for the first time all day. You okay? I looked up at him. My son. 38 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway in his socks, holding his phone with $400,000 of his mother's money already spoken for and a beach house already half built in his imagination. Go to bed, Daniel, I said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded once and went back down the hall. I stayed in Linda's chair until the clock on the microwave read 11:42. Then I got up, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to the bedroom alone. Alan Porter's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building on K Street, the kind of Sacramento address that had been respectable for so long it had stopped needing to prove it. The directory in the lobby listed 17 names. Porter and Associates was near the bottom in plain black letters, no logo, no tagline. Linda had chosen him 12 years ago when her mother's estate went through probate, and she had stayed with him because, as she put it, he never made her feel stupid for asking a question twice. I had taken the stairs instead of the elevator. Old habit. I had spent enough years in the shop climbing ladders and carrying lumber that elevators still felt like a small surrender. On the 4th floor landing, I stopped and straightened my collar. I was wearing the sport coat I kept for occasions that required something between a suit and a flannel shirt. Linda had called it my serious jacket. I had worn it to Brandon's school concerts and to the bank when we refinanced the house, and to the oncologist's office the first time when the word cancer had entered our lives and rearranged everything inside it. Alan Porter met me at the door himself. He was in his early 60s, lean with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the kind of unhurried manner that either meant he had all the time in the world or had learned to appear that way regardless. He shook my hand and held it a beat longer than a standard handshake, the way people do when they want to acknowledge something without saying it out loud. Mr. Hayes, I'm very sorry about Linda. Thank you for seeing me quickly, I said. He led me into a conference room with a long oak table, good wood quarter sawn, the kind that costs real money and lasts 100 years. I noticed it the way I always noticed good wood automatically, the way a mechanic notices an engine sound without deciding to listen. There was a legal pad, a bottle of water, and a box of tissues set at my end of the table. I looked at the tissues and decided I would not need them. I had been making that decision every morning for a week. Alan sat across from me and opened a folder. Before we go into the specifics, he said, I want to explain how Linda structured things because it's a little different from a standard will. All right. See, Linda did not leave a traditional will, Alan said. She established a revocable living trust 14 months ago, which she converted to an irrevocable trust 9 months ago when her prognosis changed. He paused to let that land. In California, a properly structured trust allows assets to pass outside of probate, meaning faster, more private, and with more control over distribution conditions. He folded his hands on the table. The trust names you, Richard, as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. You have full legal authority over all assets immediately. No court involvement, no waiting period. And, Daniel, I asked. Alan's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly. The careful neutrality of a professional delivering information he knows will hurt. Daniel is not named as a beneficiary in the trust. Linda made that decision deliberately and documented her reasoning in a letter she left with me. I sat with that for a moment. The oak table, the morning light coming through the window, the box of tissues I was not going to need. How much are we talking about? I asked. Because I needed to know. Because Daniel had already started spending it, and I needed to understand the full weight of what he had been spending. Alan referenced a page in his folder. After the house, which is already in your name and unaffected by the trust holds liquid assets, investment accounts, and the proceeds from Linda's life insurance policy. He looked up. The total value of trust assets as of last month is approximately $840,000. $840,000. Linda had grown up in a house where her father worked double shifts at a paper mill, and her mother sewed clothing alterations from a card table in the bedroom. She had put herself through nursing school on scholarships and part-time work. She had managed our household finances for 42 years with a combination of discipline and quiet determination that I had always respected, but perhaps never fully understood, until this moment, sitting across from her attorney, in a room with a quarter-sawn oak table, hearing the number she had built. Daniel doesn't know the amount, I said. It was not a question. Linda asked me not to disclose specifics to anyone but you, Alan said. I nodded. Outside the window, a city bus moved down K Street. Normal Friday morning in Sacramento. People going to work, getting coffee, living the ordinary day that Linda would never have again. So, there's one more thing, Alan said. He reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Linda's handwriting, that familiar, slight rightward lean, the letters careful and deliberate, the way her handwriting had always looked like she was paying attention to what she was saying. She wrote this 8 months ago, Alan said. She asked me to give it to you in this meeting after you heard everything else. She was very specific about the order. I reached out and took the envelope. The paper was slightly thicker than regular stationery. Linda had always bought good paper, said it was one of the few luxuries that cost almost nothing and made everything feel more considered. I turned it over in my hands, my name in her handwriting. Richard. I pressed my thumb along the sealed edge. Then I stopped. Something in me was not ready. Not here, not in this conference room with its box of tissues and its quarter-sawn oak, and Alan Porter watching me with professional compassion from across the table. Whatever Linda had written in this letter, I wanted to read it in a place where I could react without an audience, where I could be whatever I needed to be without managing anyone else's comfort at the same time. Not yet, I said. I set the envelope carefully on the table in front of me, smoothed it once with my palm, and looked up at Alan. You said there was one more thing. Before the letter. Alan reached back into the folder. Yes, he said. There is. He slid a document across the table toward me, 6 pages stapled in the upper left corner. The top page had a title centered in bold type, Hayes Family Retirement and Asset Plan. Below the title in smaller text, prepared by Daniel R. Hayes, December 3, 2024. I picked up the document with both hands. The paper was standard legal weight, printed cleanly, the margins even. Daniel had formatted it the way he formatted everything at work: headers in bold subsections, indented a professional template, borrowed from a world where spreadsheets passed for sincerity. I had seen his work presentations before, when he used to bring his laptop to Sunday dinners and show Linda quarterly projections like she was a board member instead of his mother. She had always listened patiently. She had always asked the right questions. I had always wondered, watching those dinners, whether she was more impressed or more worried. Now I knew. The first page was an overview. Daniel had titled it with the kind of language that sounds reasonable until you read it slowly. Hayes Family Retirement and Asset Plan. Family. As though the family had been consulted. As though the family had sat around a table and agreed that this was the direction everyone wanted to go. I read it slowly. Section 1 covered what Daniel called the primary residence transition. He proposed selling the house in Sacramento, my house, the one I had bought in 1987, the one where Daniel had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, the one where Linda had planted that oak tree in the backyard, and using the proceeds combined with trust assets to purchase a property in Santa Barbara. Estimated budget $1.2 million. The section included a paragraph explaining that Sacramento was, in Daniel's assessment, no longer the right environment for a man of my age, and that coastal living offered documented health benefits for older adults, a man of my age. I set the first page down and moved to the second. Section 2 was labeled Family Support Allocation. Underneath that heading, Daniel had itemized the following: $400,000 to Margaret Saunders for debt resolution and financial stabilization. A note in parentheses read, essential for Jessica's peace of mind and family harmony. Below that, a separate line item, $250,000, allocated to Daniel and Jessica Hayes for lifestyle transition costs, including vehicle upgrades, home furnishings for new primary residence, and a 6-month living reserve, while Daniel transitioned out of his current employment. Lifestyle transition costs. I looked up at Alan Porter. He was watching me with the careful stillness of a man who has read this document before and has already finished being angry about it. How did Linda get this? I asked. Daniel sent it to her directly, Alan said. By email on December 4th. He told her he wanted her blessing before he moved forward with any planning. Her blessing. I repeated the word the way you repeat a word when your brain needs a moment to confirm that it actually means what you think it means. Yes. And she never said a word to me. No. Alan leaned forward slightly. She called me the morning after she received it. That was December 5th. We met 3 days later on December 8th, and she began the process of converting her existing revocable trust into an irrevocable structure. She moved quickly and deliberately. She knew exactly what she wanted. I turned to page 3. The third section was titled Asset Optimization, which turned out to mean the sale of my woodworking shop. Daniel had written that the Sacramento property, meaning the shop on Fruit Ridge Road, that I had built from a failing lumber yard into a functioning business over 35 years, represented an underutilized asset that could be liquidated to supplement the overall estate plan. He had estimated the property value at $380,000. He had already identified a potential buyer. He had written that I referred to throughout the document as Richard, or the senior Mr. Hayes, would benefit from the reduced stress of retirement and would be provided comfortable accommodations within the new family residence. Comfortable accommodations within the new family residence. I had spent 35 years building things with my hands. I had taught 3 apprentices who now ran their own shops. I had custom-built furniture that was sitting in homes across Sacramento County in restaurants and offices and a library reading room that Linda had made me drive past twice after the installation, just so she could see it from the street. And Daniel had looked at all of that and written the words underutilized asset. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected. Not grief exactly. Something older than grief. Something closer to the particular ache of being looked at by someone who has known you your entire life and still managed not to see you at all. I turned to page 4. My name appeared 11 times across the remaining pages. Richard's projected needs. Richard's estimated monthly expenses. Richard's health considerations. Richard's anticipated timeline for full retirement. In every instance, my name appeared as a category to be managed, a variable in an equation, a line item in a budget. In not one instance did my name appear alongside a question. Not what does Richard want? Not what would Richard prefer? Not has anyone asked Richard. I set the document down on the table. Alan did not rush me. He refilled my water glass from the pitcher on the credenza behind him and set it back within reach, and then he returned to his chair and waited with the patience of a man who understood that some silences needed to finish themselves. She knew, I said finally. She knew, and she didn't tell me, and she spent the last 8 months of her life fixing it quietly so I wouldn't have to fight about it. That's correct, Alan said, because she knew I would have confronted Daniel. She wrote about that. Alan nodded toward the envelope still sitting on the table in front of me. She was very clear about why she handled it the way she did. I looked at the envelope. My name in her handwriting. The slight rightward lean of the letters. 42 years of reading her grocery lists and birthday cards, and the notes she used to leave on my workbench when she wanted to tell me something she found easier to write than to say. I picked it up. This time I did not put it back down. I read Linda's letter in the car. I did not trust myself to read it in Alan's conference room, and I did not trust myself to wait until I got home. So I sat in the parking structure on J Street with the engine off and the letter open across the steering wheel, and I read every word my wife had written me from the other side of whatever line she had crossed in October. She had written 4 pages in the careful, unhurried script she used when she was being deliberate. She wrote that she had not told me about Daniel's plan because she knew exactly what I would have done. I would have confronted him, and Daniel would have apologized just enough to make me feel like the situation was resolved, and then I would have spent the remaining months of her life managing the tension between us, instead of just being with her. She wrote that she was sorry for making a decision that affected me without telling me, but that she was not sorry for the decision itself. She wrote that the trust was not a punishment for Daniel. It was a pause. A structure designed to give me time to see clearly before I acted. She wrote, I know you, Richard Hayes. You would have forgiven him before you understood what you were forgiving. I sat in that parking structure for 20 minutes after I finished reading. Then I folded the letter back along its original creases, put it in the interior pocket of my serious jacket, and drove home. The house was empty when I got back. Daniel's car was gone. I did not know where he had gone, and I did not call to ask. I changed out of the sport coat, hung it carefully on the back of the bedroom door, and put on my work jeans and a flannel shirt. Then I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Because Linda had always said that the solution to most things was not action, but temperature, something hot when you were cold, something cold when you were overheated, and enough patience to tell the difference. The kettle had just started to whistle when my phone rang. Tommy Briggs. I picked up before the second ring. Boss. Tommy's voice was the same as it had always been, low, unhurried, with the particular roughness of a man who had spent 30 years breathing sawdust and never quite complained about it. He had started calling me boss in 1999 and had never stopped, even after I told him twice that we were not that kind of operation. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me straight." I poured the hot water over the tea bag and set the mug on the counter. "Go ahead, Tommy. So is it true you're selling the shop?" The mug was too hot to hold. I set it down. Tommy Briggs had been with me for 27 years. He had shown up as a 21-year-old with no formal training and hands that already knew how to work. And he had stayed through the recession and the slow years and the years when I had seriously considered closing and the years when we had more orders than we could fill. He knew the shop the way a person knows a house they grew up in, not just the layout, but the feeling of it, the way the light came through the west windows in the afternoon, the way the big table saw ran slightly warm if you pushed it past 4 hours without a break. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. "Daniel came by," Tommy said. "About 3 weeks ago. Brought a guy with him, said he was a potential buyer, wanted to walk the floor." A pause. "Daniel told me you'd already agreed to it. Said you were tired, ready to retire, and that the sale was basically done. He said the new owner would probably keep most of us on, but that I should start thinking about what I wanted to do next." My hand tightened around the phone. "He told the other guys the same thing," Tommy continued. "I didn't say anything because Daniel said you were dealing with Mrs. Hayes being sick, and he didn't want us bothering you about business stuff. I figured you'd talk to me when you were ready." Another pause, longer this time. "But then I heard Mrs. Hayes passed, and I thought, boss, I need to ask you directly. Because if the shop is gone, I need to know. My wife's been offered a position in Portland. We've been going back and forth on it. This changes things." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree was losing its leaves in the particular way California oaks do in October. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily and without fanfare, letting go of one thing at a time. "Tommy," I said, "the shop is not for sale." Silence on the line. Then Daniel said, Daniel was wrong. I kept my voice even. "Nobody is selling anything. Tell your wife to keep thinking about Portland on its own merits, because the shop has nothing to do with it. You still have a job as long as you want one." Tommy exhaled a long, slow breath that told me he had been holding it for 3 weeks. "Okay," he said. "Okay, boss. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just show up Monday." "I'll be there at 6. We hung up. I stood at the kitchen window with my phone in my hand, and the oak tree shedding its leaves outside, and 35 years of my working life sitting on Fruit Ridge Road, waiting to find out whether I still had the energy to defend it. The answer, I realized, was yes. Not the hot, reactive energy of a man who has just been insulted. Something quieter and more durable than that. The same energy that had gotten me through the slow years and the recession and the mornings after Linda's worst nights in the hospital, when I had driven to the shop at 5 in the morning, just to stand in the smell of sawdust and remind myself that I still knew how to make something that would last. I picked up my mug. The tea had cooled to the right temperature. I was still standing at the window when I heard the front door open and Jessica's voice in the hallway, followed by the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, hers and a stranger's, and the particular businesslike tone she used when she was performing competence for an audience. "The square footage up here is actually better than I remembered," she was saying. "If we reconfigure the layout, the attic room could work really well for him." I set my mug down on the counter and walked to the hallway. Jessica was standing at the foot of the stairs with a man I had never seen before, mid-40s. Cargo pants, a tape measure clipped to his belt, and a notepad tucked under his arm. Behind him was a younger man with a camera phone already raised, photographing the ceiling above the landing. Neither of them had taken off their shoes at the door. Linda had always asked people to take off their shoes at the door. Jessica turned when she heard me. She had the particular expression of someone who has been caught doing something they were planning to explain later. rearranged quickly into something that resembled confidence. "Oh, good, you're home," she said, as though this were my unexpected arrival rather than hers. "This is Greg. He does residential renovation consulting. I just wanted to get a sense of what the space could look like, going forward." Greg extended his hand. I shook it because I was 68 years old, and my mother had raised me to shake hands regardless of how I felt about the hand I was shaking. "Mr. Hayes," he said. "Nice place, good bones." "Thank you," I said. "What exactly are you here to assess?" Jessica stepped in before Greg could answer. "Just the general layout. The square footage on the main floor, the attic room upstairs." She gestured toward the ceiling with the easy authority of a woman who had already mentally redecorated. "We were thinking if the layout got reconfigured a little, the attic room could be really comfortable. Plenty of space for one person." One person. She did not say my name. She did not need to. The attic room was where I stored my overflow woodworking tools, the jigs and forms and specialty clamps that did not fit in the shop, the things I reached for twice a year and could not do without when I needed them. It was also directly above the garage, which meant it ran 15 degrees hotter than the rest of the house in summer, and 15 degrees colder in winter, and had a ceiling that sloped down to 4 feet on both sides. Linda and I had used it as a guest room exactly once when her cousin visited from Tucson in 2009. The cousin had slept there one night and spent the next 2 at a Holiday Inn on Arden Way. "I see," I said. Greg was already moving toward the living room, his younger colleague photographing baseboards. I followed them. Jessica walked beside me with the careful brightness of someone who has decided the best approach to a difficult conversation is to have it so quickly it cannot become difficult. "The main floor has great flow," she was saying. "If we opened up the wall between the dining room and the kitchen, it could actually work really well as a short-term rental space. There's a whole market for that in Sacramento right now. Older neighborhoods, established areas, people on Airbnb specifically look for that kind of character." Airbnb. She said the word, the way people say it when they expect it to sound like opportunity. I heard it the way I imagine Linda would have heard it, as the sound of 42 years of Saturday morning breakfasts and Christmas mornings, and the specific quiet of a house that knows you being converted into a nightly rate, and a star rating, and a checkout time of 11. "Jessica," I said. She turned to me with her bright, prepared expression. "Where did you imagine I would be?" I asked, while strangers were staying in my dining room. She blinked. "The attic room is actually really—" "I heard you the first time." Greg had moved to the back door and was looking out at the yard. His colleague was measuring the kitchen doorway with the tape measure from his belt, calling numbers out loud that the younger man was writing down. I watched them work for a moment. Professional, efficient, completely indifferent to the fact that they were standing in a house where a woman had died 6 days ago. I walked to the back door and opened it. The yard was the same as it always was. Linda's garden beds along the left fence going brown now in the October. Cool the oak tree in the center, dropping leaves onto the grass I had mowed 2 weeks ago when the hospice nurse said Linda was still stable. Against the back fence next to the rusting garden cart Linda kept meaning to replace was the rocking chair. I had built that chair in the winter of 2013, the year Linda turned 60. Quarter sawn white oak, the same species as the conference table in Alan Porter's office, though I had noticed Alan's table before I remembered the chair. I had spent 11 weeks on it. The joinery was hand-cut. The finish was an oil and wax blend Linda had chosen herself from a woodworking supplier's catalog, sitting at the kitchen table with reading glasses on, and her finger running down the color swatches the way she used to run her finger down menus in restaurants, seriously, as though the decision mattered. The chair was sitting in the dirt beside the garden cart. One of its rockers was resting in a shallow puddle from last night's rain. The finish I had spent 3 days applying was filmed with grime and watermarks. Jessica appeared beside me in the doorway. She looked at the chair, then at me. "I moved it out temporarily," she said. "There wasn't room inside with all the condolence flowers. I was going to bring it back in." "When?" I asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. "The flowers have been gone for 2 days," I said. I stepped out into the yard and walked to the chair. I crouched down beside it and looked at the rocker sitting in the puddle. The wood had not warped. White oak was resilient, one of the reasons I had chosen it, but the finish was damaged along the bottom edge, a cloudy white film where the moisture had lifted the wax layer. Repairable, but not easily. Not without stripping and refinishing the entire rocker. I lifted the chair by its arms and carried it back inside. I set it in the corner of the kitchen near the window where Linda used to sit in it on Sunday mornings with her coffee and the newspaper she refused to read on a screen because she said she thought better with paper in her hands. Greg was writing something on his notepad. His colleague was packing away the tape measure. "I think we have what we need," Greg said to Jessica. He glanced at me with the mild, professional neutrality of a man who has learned not to read rooms too carefully. "I'll have preliminary numbers to you by end of week." Jessica walked them to the door. I heard her voice in the hallway, lower now, quicker, and then the sound of the front door closing. She came back to the kitchen and found me standing next to Linda's chair. "Richard, Greg can keep his numbers," I said. "This house is not a rental property. It will not be reconfigured. And that chair does not go outside again." Jessica had left by 8 that evening without saying goodbye. I heard her car back out of the driveway, the particular sound of tires on the concrete apron Linda had always said needed resurfacing. And then the neighborhood went quiet in the way neighborhoods go quiet on weekday evenings in Sacramento, which is not truly quiet, but layered a collage of televisions and distant dogs and the occasional truck on the boulevard 2 streets over. Daniel came home around 9, saw me reading at the kitchen table, said he was tired, and went to bed. We did not discuss Greg or the tape measure or the attic room or the rocking chair. There are conversations that need a night between them and the moment that made them necessary. I was up at 5:30 the next morning. I made coffee, fed the dog, a 14-year-old beagle named Hector, who had belonged to Linda in every way that mattered, and was now navigating the house with the confused devotion of an animal that keeps looking for someone in all the places she used to be, and sat at the kitchen table with the Hayes family retirement and asset plan in front of me, reading it a second time. The second reading was worse than the first. The first time I had been in Alan Porter's conference room, operating under the ambient shock of everything I had learned that morning. The second time I was in my own kitchen, in my own flannel shirt, with my own coffee in the mug from the Oregon roadside shop, and every line of Daniel's document landed with the full weight of its familiarity. This was not a stranger's plan. This was my son's handwriting, the same boy who had once cried for 40 minutes because he lost his baseball mitt, who had called me from his college dorm at 11 at night because he was homesick and did not want to admit it, who had stood beside me at Linda's hospital bed last month and held her hand. The doorbell rang at 9:15. Hector lifted his head from his bed in the corner, decided the effort of barking was not warranted, and put his head back down. I went to the door. The man on the porch was about my height, early 50s, in a collared shirt and dark slacks. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to presenting himself as trustworthy, shoulders back, direct eye contact, a briefcase held at his side with the relaxed grip of a man who carried one every day. "Mr. Hayes," he said. "My name is Jason Mercer. I believe you and I have some business to discuss. I apologize for coming without calling ahead. I thought this was the kind of conversation better had in person." I looked at him for a moment. The name was familiar. Tommy had mentioned a Jason Mercer on the phone yesterday. The potential buyer. The man Daniel had brought to the shop. "Come in," I said. I led him to the kitchen table. I offered coffee. He accepted. We sat across from each other with the Hayes family retirement and asset plan still sitting at my elbow, face down, though I suspected Jason Mercer already knew what was in it. He opened his briefcase and removed a folder. Inside was a set of documents, a purchase agreement, a property disclosure form, and a single page with a signature line at the bottom. He turned that page toward me and set it flat on the table between us. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "I met your son at a commercial real estate event in San Francisco about 6 weeks ago. He approached me about a woodworking property on Fruit Ridge Road, said his father was retiring and looking to sell quickly. We met twice at the property. Your foreman showed us around. He believed the sale had your blessing." "It did not," I said. "I know that now." Jason Mercer tapped the signature page. "This is the authorization form my attorney prepared for the transfer of ownership. It requires the seller's signature." He paused. "3 days ago, Daniel brought me this page with a signature on it. He said you had signed it at home, that your hands were unsteady from a health issue, and you preferred to sign privately." I looked at the signature on the page. It was not my signature. I have signed my name the same way since I was 19 years old. Block capitals, Richard T. Hayes. The T pressed harder than the other letters, because my father had done it that way, and I had picked up the habit without noticing. The signature on that page was lowercase, slightly shaky, the careful imitation of a hand that has lost its steadiness. My son had forged my signature. He had sat somewhere at his kitchen table in his car at a coffee shop and practiced writing my name in a way that would pass for the handwriting of an old man who was losing his grip. And then he had delivered it to a stranger as though it were the most ordinary transaction in the world. I set the page down, picked up my coffee, took a long, slow sip. Jason Mercer watched me do this with the careful attention of a man waiting to see what kind of person he is dealing with. "I don't want this property under these circumstances," he said. "I've been in business for 22 years, and I've never completed a transaction I wasn't certain was clean. When I looked at that signature more carefully, I had concerns. My attorney confirmed them." He began gathering the documents back into his folder. "I'm returning everything to you. The deal is off. I wanted to tell you directly, rather than simply going quiet, because you deserve to know what was presented in your name." He closed the folder and slid it across the table toward me. I accepted it, held it in both hands for a moment. 35 years of work. The shop where Tommy showed up at 6 every morning, and where I had built things I was proud of, furniture that would outlast me, cabinets in houses where children would grow up and never know my name, but run their hands along wood I had cut and joined and finished with more care than anything I had ever done for money. "Thank you," I said, "for coming here, for telling me yourself." Jason Mercer nodded. He stood, picked up his briefcase, and extended his hand. I shook it this time without the complicated feelings of the handshake at the door. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. I opened the folder and looked at the forged signature one more time. Then I placed it carefully in the kitchen drawer, the deep one on the left, where Linda used to keep the serious documents, the insurance papers, and the appliance warranties, and the things that needed to be findable when it mattered. Above me, I heard Daniel's alarm go off, then the sound of his feet on the floor, then the shower. I closed the drawer, stood up, and started making breakfast. Daniel and I ate breakfast together that morning without discussing anything that mattered. He came downstairs in a clean shirt, poured coffee, asked if there was enough orange juice, and sat down across from me at the table where Jason Mercer had sat an hour earlier. I had cleared away the folder. I had put the forged signature back in Linda's drawer. The kitchen looked the same as it always looked, the rocking chair in the corner, the sympathy cards on the side table, Hector asleep on his bed, with his chin on the edge of his water bowl. Daniel scrolled through his phone while he ate. I read the back of the cereal box the way I did when I had nothing to say and needed somewhere to put my eyes. He left mid-morning without saying where he was going. I spent the day doing the things that needed doing. I called the funeral home about the death certificate copies. California law required multiple certified copies for settling an estate, and Alan Porter had asked me to get at least 8. I called Linda's sister in Portland again. I walked Hector twice around the block slowly because Hector was 14 and had earned the right to stop and smell whatever he wanted for as long as he wanted. In the afternoon, I sat in the backyard in Linda's rocking chair and watched the oak tree lose its leaves and did not think about anything in particular, which is its own kind of thinking. Daniel came home at 6. Jessica arrived 20 minutes later with takeout containers from a Thai place on Riverside Boulevard pad. Thai spring rolls, that mango salad Linda had always ordered, and Daniel had always said was too sweet. The three of us ate at the kitchen table with the careful politeness of people who have agreed without discussing it, to hold certain things at a distance for one more evening. After dinner, Jessica washed the containers and stacked them for recycling, which Linda had always done too, and I noticed it the way you notice when someone performs a familiar gesture that does not belong to them yet. Daniel took a phone call in the living room. Jessica said she was tired and drove home. I told Daniel good night at 9 and went upstairs. I did not fall asleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle the particular creaks and contractions of a structure that has housed the same family for 38 years and knows how to talk about it. At some point, I heard Daniel moving around downstairs. The refrigerator opened and closed. The television came on low, then off again. Then quiet. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time. My hand closed around a phone that was not mine. Same model, same case Daniel had bought us. Matching OtterBox cases last Christmas, navy blue, because he said mine kept cracking and he wanted to get me something practical. I had thought it was thoughtful at the time. I turned the screen toward me and pressed the side button. The screen lit up. It was Daniel's phone. The screen showed the tail end of a text conversation, the most recent messages visible without unlocking. The contact name at the top was Jessica. The last exchange sat there in the blue and gray bubbles of an iMessage thread, 3 messages, time-stamped. Jessica, 11:44 p.m., October 5th. Are you still at the hospital? Daniel, 11:47 p.m., October 5th. Just stepped out. It won't be long now. Tomorrow we can finally start, babe. Jessica, 11:49 p.m., October 5th. I already scheduled the realtor for 9 a.m. I love you. Come home soon. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you have already broken by picking it up. October 5th. 11:47 at night. I had been in that hospital room. I had been sitting in the vinyl chair beside Linda's bed with her hand in both of mine, listening to the particular rhythm of the monitors and the particular silence between the beeps that told me we were running out of particular silences. The hospice nurse had come in at 11:30 and checked the IV and adjusted something on the monitor and looked at me with an expression that did not require translation. Daniel had been in the hallway. That was what he had told me, that he needed some air, that he would be right back, that he was going to get a cup of coffee from the machine on the second floor. I had nodded because a person only has so much attention at moments like that, and I had given all of mine to Linda. He had been in the hallway texting his wife about the realtor appointment. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and held it there. The grief that moved through me in that moment was different from the grief I had been carrying all week. That grief was clean the honest pain of losing someone you loved after a long life together. This was something else. This was the grief of a particular kind of betrayal, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically, but seeps in slowly through the specific details. 11:47, 9 a.m. Finally start come home soon, until it has soaked through everything, and you understand that the moment you thought you were sharing with someone you were actually alone. I got up. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Sacramento at midnight in October. The maple on the Hendersons' lawn had gone completely orange-lit orange gold under the streetlight. Linda had loved that tree. Every fall she commented on it. This past September she had looked at it from the car window coming home from her last oncology appointment and said quietly, more to herself than to me, that she was glad it had been a good year for color. I stood at the window until my breathing steadied. Then I went to the closet and took down the oak picture frame from the shelf where I had placed it that morning, after rehunging it in the living room, that had been 2 days ago. The days were beginning to compress. I carried the wedding photograph to the bed and set it on Linda's pillow facing me. She was laughing in the picture. Not at the camera. At something real. I lay down beside it and stared at the ceiling until 5 in the morning, when the sky outside the window began to go gray, and I got up and went downstairs and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window and decided that I was done waiting to understand what was happening in my own house. I was at the hospital by 7:30. Mercy General was 12 minutes from the house on a morning with no traffic, and at 7:30 on a Sunday in Sacramento, there was no traffic. I had driven those 12 minutes so many times over the past 14 months that my hands knew the route without consulting my eyes left on Stockton, right on Broadway, into the parking structure on the north side, where the attendant on the early shift always nodded at me because he had seen me often enough to recognize me without knowing my name. I signed in at the front desk and explained that I was there to collect my wife's personal belongings. The woman at the desk, young, efficient, the particular kind of tired that belongs to people finishing a night shift, typed something, made a call, and asked me to wait in the chairs by the window. I waited 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock above the nurse's station, not because I was impatient, but because watching a clock is something to do with your eyes when the alternative is looking at the room around you and remembering every version of it you have sat in over the past year. A nurse came out with a plastic bag sealed at the top, the kind hospitals use for patient belongings, white with a red biohazard stripe along the side that always seemed excessive for the contents, which in Linda's case turned out to be her reading glasses, her wedding ring, the small leather wallet she carried in her cardigan pocket, and the paperback novel she had been reading in her better weeks and had not opened in her last 3. The nurse, her badge said Patricia, and she had the manner of someone who had done this particular handoff enough times to know that efficiency was its own form of kindness, set the bag on the counter between us. "There's also this," Patricia said. She slid a single sheet of paper across the counter. "It's a copy of the emergency contact form from your wife's file. We return these with the belongings per hospital policy. You may want to review it for your records." I picked up the paper. It was a standard form, 2 columns, fields for primary and secondary emergency contacts, space for relationship and phone number. Linda had filled out the primary contact herself when she was first admitted 14 months ago. I could see the original entry in her handwriting, my name, our home number, the word husband in the relationship field. Her careful script with its familiar rightward lean. Beside it, in different ink and a different hand, was a second entry. More recent. The relationship field had been updated. The name listed was Daniel R. Hayes. The phone number was Daniel's cell, and in the notes field at the bottom of the form, in handwriting, I did not recognize were 11 words that I read 3 times to make sure I was reading them correctly. Spouse is elderly. Limited capacity for medical decision-making. I stood at that counter for a long time. Patricia had moved away to attend to something else, which I was grateful for. The lobby around me continued its morning business. A woman with a child on her hip asking about visiting hours, two orderlies moving a cart of linens, the automatic doors opening and closing as the early visitors came in from the cold. All of it happening at a perfectly ordinary distance from the piece of paper in my hands. Spouse is elderly. Limited capacity for medical decision-making. I was 68 years old. I had run a business for 35 years, managed employees, filed taxes, negotiated contracts, made every significant financial and medical decision in our household for 4 decades. I had sat in oncologist offices and asked the right questions and understood the answers and advocated for Linda's care with enough clarity that her primary physician had once told me I would have made a good patient advocate professionally. And my son had written 11 words on a hospital form that described me as a man who could not be trusted to decide things for himself. I folded the paper once and put it in the interior pocket of my jacket next to Linda's letter. Then I picked up the plastic bag with her belongings and walked back through the lobby and out through the automatic doors into the October morning. I sat in the car for a long time before starting the engine. The thing about discovering something like that, something that reframes not just the present but the past, is that your mind does not process it all at once. It comes in layers. The first layer is the simple fact of it. The second layer is the implication. The third layer, the one that takes the longest, is the inventory, the careful, painful cataloging of all the moments you now have to look at differently. I thought about the meeting with Linda's oncologist 6 months ago, when Daniel had insisted on coming along and had positioned himself slightly in front of me in the chair arrangement, slightly closer to the doctor's desk. I had thought he was being protective. Now I wondered whether he had been practicing something. I thought about the time Daniel had taken Linda to her Tuesday appointment because I had a delivery to oversee at the shop and could not get away. When I had asked Linda that evening how it went, she had said fine, and something in the way she said it had made me ask again, and she had said Daniel had done most of the talking. I had thought she was tired. I had thought she meant it as a compliment. I started the engine. On the drive home, I stopped at the Safeway on Freeport Boulevard and bought a bag of coffee and a carton of orange juice and a box of the shortbread cookies Linda had kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, and that I had been eating one at a time, slowly, the way you eat something when you are aware it is the last box and you have not decided whether to buy another one or let the absence of it be what it is. I bought another box. Carol was deadheading the roses along her front fence when I pulled into the driveway. She straightened up and looked at me over the low pickets with the expression she had been wearing all week, present attentive, not pushing. "You all right?" she asked. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not entirely," I said, "but I think I'm getting clearer." She nodded as though that was a reasonable answer, which it was, and went back to her roses. Inside, I put the groceries away, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. Daniel's bedroom door was still closed upstairs. I could hear him moving around the floorboards above the kitchen, gave away every step. I opened Linda's wallet and looked at the contents. Her driver's license, 2 credit cards, a library card, a photograph so old and small it had gone soft at the edges. Brandon, at about 3 years old, sitting in the rocking chair in the living room, laughing at something off camera. She had carried that photograph in her wallet for 5 years. I heard Daniel's footsteps reach the top of the stairs, then start down. Daniel came downstairs in yesterday's clothes. He had the look of a man who had not slept well and was trying not to show it. Jaw set, eyes slightly tight at the corners, moving through the kitchen with the deliberate energy of someone using motion as a substitute for composure. He poured coffee without looking at me, leaned against the counter, and stared out the window at the backyard, the way people stare at things when they are actually looking inward. I was at the table with 2 mugs already poured. I had been up since 5. I had showered, dressed, made breakfast, eaten, washed the dishes, and sat down with my coffee and the morning quiet and the particular patience that comes from having spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision. "Sit down," I said. "Coffee's hot." Daniel turned from the window. He looked at the 2 mugs on the table, then at me with the wariness of a man trying to determine whether an invitation is also a trap. Then he pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down. We drank coffee for a moment without speaking. Outside, a scrub jay landed on the fence above Linda's garden beds and made the sharp, declarative sound scrub jays make when they have decided a territory belongs to them. Linda had always liked scrub jays. She said they were the most honest birds in California because they never pretended to be something gentler than they were. "I need to talk to you about the estate," Daniel said. He wrapped both hands around his mug the way he had as a child when he was cold or uncertain. "There are some things that are coming due. The deposit on the Santa Barbara property, I put down $15,000 on a refundable hold, but the refund window closes in 3 weeks. And the vehicle situation." He exhaled. "I need to know when money is going to be accessible." I looked at my son across the table. He had his mother's jaw and my stubborn streak, and 38 years of being loved by both of us without condition, and he was sitting in Linda's kitchen 8 days after her death, asking me when the money was going to be accessible. I held all of that in my chest and kept my face where I needed it to be. "The money is in the trust," I said. "The trust is managed through Alan Porter's office. There are processes." I paused. "And honestly, Daniel, I'm not sure I want to touch any of it right now. Your mother's been gone 8 days. I'd like to let things sit for a while." Daniel's hands tightened around the mug. "How long's a while?" "I don't know yet." "Cha-cha-cha." His voice shifted, the shift I had been waiting for, the one underneath the careful surface he had been maintaining all week. "I have real deadlines here. The $15,000 deposit is gone if I don't act. The car payment, I have a bridge loan on the SUV that comes due in 60 days. I structured it that way because I expected the estate to clear faster." I kept my voice gentle. "You structured a loan around your mother's estate before she died." He had the grace to look away briefly. "I was planning ahead." "Tell me about the planning," I said. And here was the thing about what happened next that I had not entirely anticipated. Daniel told me. Not everything he did not confess to, the forged signature or the hospital form, did not acknowledge that I had heard his phone calls or read his messages or received a visit from Jason Mercer. But he laid out the broad architecture of it with the impatient candor of a man who has been holding a secret that has become inconvenient and has decided that partial disclosure is the same as honesty. The Santa Barbara property, the loan on the SUV, his intention to resign from his job, the conversation he had with Jessica about converting this house into a short-term rental, the promise to Margaret. He laid it out the way you lay out a business proposal, item by item, with the implicit argument that the reasonableness of each individual piece should be sufficient to justify the whole. When he finished, I nodded slowly. "How much of this did you discuss with your mother?" I asked. He picked up his mug, set it down without drinking. "She knew my general thinking." "Did she agree with your general thinking?" The question sat between us on the table. Daniel's jaw worked once. "She didn't object." "She didn't object," I repeated. "No." I thought about Linda sitting at her kitchen table on December 5th, reading Daniel's 6-page plan on her laptop, and then calling Alan Porter at 8 the next morning. I thought about what it costs a person to keep a secret like that for 8 months while undergoing chemotherapy, while managing her own fear and her own pain, while making sure every Sunday phone call with her son still sounded like an ordinary Sunday phone call. I thought about what she had written in her letter. You would have forgiven him before you understood what you were forgiving. Dad. Daniel leaned forward. His voice had dropped, and underneath the impatience there was something that sounded for the first time like genuine fear. I already quit my job. I can't unquit it. I need this to work. I looked at him for a long moment. I know, I said. His shoulders dropped slightly with relief. I know you already quit, I said. And I know you need this to work. But Daniel, what you need and what I owe you are two different things. I picked up my mug. I'm going to take some time before I make any decisions about the trust. That's not a punishment. That's just where I am. Daniel stared at me. The relief drained out of his face, replaced by something harder. He pushed back from the table. His chair scraped against the linoleum the way chairs scrape when someone stands up faster than they planned to. You're being selfish, he said. His voice had gone flat and tight. Mom didn't work her whole life so you could sit on it. The scrub jay outside made its sharp sound again from the fence. Your mother worked her whole life, I said, so that she could decide what happened to it. And she did. I set my mug down. She decided. Daniel picked up his phone from the table and walked to the doorway. He stopped with his back to me, one hand on the frame. I'm going to Jessica's, he said. All right, I said. He left. The front door closed behind him with more force than necessary, but less than a slam, the noise of a man who wanted to make a statement, but retained enough self-awareness not to make it too loudly. I sat at the table alone. Hector padded in from the living room, looked at Daniel's empty chair, and then looked at me. He put his gray muzzle on my knee. I put my hand on his head, and we stayed like that for a while. The old dog and I in the kitchen that still smelled like Linda's coffee, and the last of the sympathy flowers, and 38 years of ordinary mornings that I would have given anything to have back. Daniel came back 2 days later. Not to apologize, I had not expected that, and I would have been suspicious if it had come too quickly. He came back because he had nowhere else to go with what had happened, and because whatever else had broken down between us, I was still his father, and the kitchen table was still the place where the Hayes family had always brought the things it did not know how to carry alone. He came in through the back door, which he had done since he was 12 years old, and did not want to announce himself. I was sanding a small jewelry box I had been working on before Linda got sick. Cherrywood hand-cut dovetail joints at the corners, a commission from a woman in Elk Grove who wanted something to leave her daughter. I had picked it up again that morning because Linda's letter had told me to go back to the shop, and I was not ready for the shop yet. So the shop had come to me instead, set up at the kitchen table with a drop cloth and my detail sander and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow. I went to see Michael Grant today, he said. Michael Grant was Daniel's direct supervisor at the logistics company, regional vice president, 15 years with the firm. The kind of man who sent handwritten thank you notes after client meetings and remembered the names of people's children. Daniel had complained about him with the particular intensity of someone who secretly respected the person they were complaining about. How did that go? I asked. I kept the sander moving in the direction of the grain, the way you always work with the grain, never against it. Daniel put his elbows on the table. He said no. I waited. My position is gone, Daniel continued. They moved Kevin up. Kevin has been with the company for 4 years. He's 31 years old. He said the age the way people say a number that offends them personally. Michael said the promotion was already in process before I resigned, that my leaving just accelerated the timeline. Did you ask about other positions? He said there might be something in the spring. Regional coordinator, probably. Less territory, less pay. Daniel picked up the corner of the drop cloth and rubbed it between his fingers the way he used to fidget with things as a boy when he was working up to saying something difficult. He also said something else. I set the sander down. Daniel looked at the cherry wood box on the table between us. The dovetail joints at the near corner were clean and tight. I had cut them by hand, with a dozuki saw and a set of chisels the way my own father had taught me, the way I had tried to teach Daniel before he decided at 14 that woodworking was not for him and switched his after-school hours to baseball. He said he was sorry about Mom, Daniel said. And then he said, Daniel, you resigned the morning after your mother passed. I don't know what to say about that, except that I hope you have good reasons. He paused. He didn't say it mean. He just said it. The kitchen was quiet, except for Hector shifting in his bed in the corner, and the sound of Carol's lawnmower starting up next door, running for 30 seconds, and then stopping, the pattern of someone who keeps starting a task and reconsidering it. What did you say to him? I asked. I said the timing was complicated. Daniel's jaw tightened. Which is the most pathetic thing I've ever said out loud. I picked up the sander again. Not because the box needed more sanding, but because I needed something to do with my hands, while I decided what kind of father to be in the next 30 seconds. There is a version of this conversation where I say, I told you so. And there is a version where I say, it will be all right. And there is a version, the true one, the only one I had left in me, where I say neither of those things, because neither of them is what my son actually needs to hear. Kevin is 31, I said. Yeah. And he's been with the company 4 years. Yeah. So he did the work, I said. And he waited. And when the opening came, he was ready. Daniel looked up at me. That's not a criticism, I said. I'm just saying what happened. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, Carol's lawnmower started again, and this time kept going. She had apparently made her decision. The October light through the kitchen window was the particular amber of late afternoon in the Central Valley, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being remembered rather than observed. I told Jessica, Daniel said, about the job. She didn't take it well. What did she say? She said she had been counting on things moving faster. He rubbed the back of his neck. She mentioned the Santa Barbara deposit. She mentioned her mother. She mentioned that she had told people. He stopped. She'd told people, Dad, her friends, her sister, that we were buying a place on the coast, that things were changing for us. He exhaled. I didn't know she'd told people. I thought about Jessica's Facebook post, the one Carol had shown me 8 days ago. So grateful for what's coming. The comment section full of congratulations from people who had been told a story about a new life that had never been real. What are you going to do? I asked. Daniel looked at the jewelry box. He reached out and touched the dovetail joint at the corner, the interlocking fingers of wood, the way 2 separate pieces become one structure through nothing but precision and patience, and the understanding that the joint only holds if both sides are cut correctly. I don't know, he said. It was the first honest answer he had given me since Linda died. Not a plan, not a projection, not a justification dressed up as an explanation. Just 3 words that meant exactly what they said. I did not know how much they had cost him to say, but I knew they had cost something, and I noted it the way you note the first sign of a season changing. Not dramatic, not certain, but real. Are you hungry? I asked. He blinked. What? It's almost 5. I was going to make soup. I stood and carried the jewelry box to the counter, set it carefully on a clean cloth, away from the stove. Linda's chicken tortilla recipe. I found her index card last week. Daniel watched me move to the refrigerator. After a moment, he said, "Yeah, okay." He did not move to help, and I did not ask him to. But he stayed at the table while I cooked, and he stayed for dinner, and he did not leave until after 8, which was the longest either of us had gone without an argument in 2 weeks. When he left, he said goodnight the way he had when he was a boy, quickly at the door, not quite looking at me, the way people say goodnight when they are not sure of their footing but are trying anyway. I stood at the kitchen window after his taillights disappeared and thought about Margaret Saunders driving up from Fresno. Carol had called her last night. Margaret Saunders drove 2.5 hours from Fresno on a Saturday morning without telling anyone she was coming. I know this because when her green Subaru pulled up in front of the house at 9:45, I was the only one there. Daniel had called the night before to say he and Jessica were coming for lunch, which I had noted and said nothing particular about. They were not due until noon. Margaret arrived 2 hours and 15 minutes ahead of them, which told me she had planned it that way. She came up the front walk carrying a casserole dish covered in foil and a paper grocery bag, moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman in her late 60s who has decided to do something difficult and has resolved not to slow down long enough to talk herself out of it. She was shorter than I remembered from the last time I had seen her at Brandon's birthday party 2 summers ago, and her hair had gone fully gray in a way that suited her. I opened the door before she could knock. She stopped on the porch and looked at me. Her eyes were red at the rims in the way of someone who has been crying at intervals for several days and has reached the point where the crying comes and goes without much warning. "Richard," she said, "I owe you an apology. I am so sorry about Linda." "Come in, Margaret." I took the casserole dish from her and led her to the kitchen. She set the grocery bag on the and began unpacking it with the focused efficiency of a woman who deals with emotion by feeding people a quart of homemade chicken broth, a loaf of sourdough bread from a Fresno bakery, a small jar of the pepper jelly Linda had once mentioned she liked at a family dinner 3 years ago that Margaret had apparently remembered and driven 2.5 hours to bring. "You didn't have to make the drive," I said. "Yes, I did." She turned from the counter and looked at me directly. "Carol called me Thursday night. She told me what's been happening. All of it." She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, Linda's chair, the one at the head, and then stopped and looked at it, and chose the chair beside it instead. "I've been up since 4 this morning trying to decide what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything." "I do." She sat down and folded her hands on the table. They were steady, which told me the decision to come had cost her the shaking and left her with the calm on the other side of it. "Daniel called me 9 days ago, the night of Linda's funeral. He told me he was going to give me $400,000. He said it like it was already done, like the money was already in an envelope with my name on it." She paused. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked where the money was coming from, and whether you knew about it, and whether any of it was real. Instead, She stopped, looked at her hands. "I told my landlord I wouldn't be renewing my lease." The refrigerator hummed. Hector came in from the living room, assessed Margaret briefly, and settled at her feet, with the quiet authority of a dog who has decided someone needs company. "How much notice did you give?" I asked. 60 days, starting November 1st. She looked up. "I have until the end of December before I need to be out." Her voice was steady, but her chin had the particular set of someone holding it that way, on purpose. "I am 67 years old, Richard. I'm not telling you that to make you feel responsible. I'm telling you so you understand that I am not naive about what it means to not have a place to live at 67. I know exactly what I walked into. It wasn't your fault. No, she agreed. But I was willing to let it be my good fortune, and that's close enough to the same thing that I've been awake since 4 in the morning about it. I heard a car door outside, then 2. Then voices on the front walk, Daniel's and Jessica's, the particular cadence of a couple having a quiet disagreement while trying to appear to be doing something else. Margaret heard it too. Her shoulders straightened, the front door opened. Daniel came into the kitchen, first started to say something and stopped when he saw his mother-in-law sitting at the table. Jessica came in behind him and went very still in the doorway. Margaret. Daniel's voice was careful. I didn't know you were coming. I know you didn't, Margaret said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. There was a quality to her stillness that I recognized, the same quality Linda had possessed, the particular authority of a woman who has decided that this is the moment and has stopped being afraid of it. Sit down, Daniel, she said. He sat. Jessica remained in the doorway. I drove up here to return something, Margaret said. I'm returning the promise you made me. I don't want it. She looked at her son-in-law across the table with the clear, undeflectable gaze of a woman who has had 2.5 hours on the highway to find the exact right words. You called me 9 days after burying your mother and promised me money that belonged to your father. You made me a beneficiary of your father's grief before he had finished grieving. And when I told my landlord I was leaving, I became someone who had made a decision based on a lie, which means I have to live with that regardless of what you do next. Daniel opened his mouth. Margaret continued. They raised Jessica to be a person of integrity, she said. I don't know where things went sideways, and I'm not here to assign blame for that today. But I am here to tell you that I will not take money from a man who is mourning his wife. I would rather work until I am 80 than do that. She turned to me. Richard, I am going to call my landlord on Monday and ask if I can rescind the notice. I think he will work with me, and if he won't, that is a problem I created, and I will find a way through it on my own. See, Margaret, I started. Please don't offer, she said. Not today. Maybe not ever. But definitely not today. Jessica made a sound in the doorway, not quite a word more, the sound of someone whose breath has caught in a way they did not plan. I looked at her. She was staring at her mother with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated than shame. The expression of a person recognizing something in someone they thought they already fully knew. Daniel was looking at the table. Margaret stood, smoothed her slacks, and picked up her purse from the back of the chair. She looked at me one last time. Linda was a good woman, she said. I am sorry she is gone, and I am sorry it took me 9 days and 2.5 hours on the 99 to say that to your face. She walked out through the front door. The three of us stayed in the kitchen in the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something that has changed the shape of the room. Daniel and Jessica left an hour after Margaret. There was no lunch. Nobody suggested it. The casserole Margaret had brought sat on the counter in its foil wrapping, and at some point Jessica moved it to the refrigerator without being asked, which was the most useful thing she had done in my house in 2 weeks. Daniel said he needed to think. Jessica said she had somewhere to be. They left separately, Daniel first, then Jessica 5 minutes later, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched 2 cars drive away in 2 different directions, and thought that there was probably a conversation happening between them by phone before either of them reached the end of the block. I spent the afternoon doing small things. I finished sanding the jewelry box. I took Hector on his slow circuit around the block, stopping at every tree and fire hydrant, an interesting patch of sidewalk he deemed worthy of investigation. I raked the oak leaves that had come down in the backyard, working in the quiet, methodical way yard work allows, where your hands are busy and your mind can go wherever it needs to go, without anyone requiring it to explain itself. Carol brought over a plate of oatmeal cookies around 4. She set them on the porch railing and said she had made too many and did not want them in her house. This was not true. Carol baked precisely never too many, never too few. But I accepted the fiction and thanked her and brought the cookies inside. By 7 that evening, the house had settled into its night sounds. Hector was asleep. The oak tree moved in the light wind coming off the valley. I made tea, the kind Linda had always kept in the cabinet above the electric kettle, a chamomile blend from a Sacramento co-op she had been buying for 15 years, the same yellow box with the same hand-drawn chamomile flower on the front. I had bought 2 new boxes at the co-op last week, without thinking about it, the way you continue the habits of a shared life before you have had time to decide which ones belong to you alone. I sat down at the kitchen table with the tea and Linda's letter. The envelope was still in the interior pocket of my serious jacket, which I had hung on the back of the bedroom door the morning I came home from Alan's office. I had taken the jacket down 3 times in the intervening days, and each time put it back without opening the pocket. Not because I was afraid of what Linda had written, because I understood in the way you understand things that do not arrive as thoughts, but as a kind of bodily knowledge that the letter needed to be read at the right moment, and that I would recognize the right moment when it came. This was the right moment. I opened the envelope carefully, the way Linda opened envelopes, along the seam, not torn, preserving the thing whole. 4 pages, both sides of 2 sheets of her good cream stationery, the paper she kept in the top drawer of the desk in the room she had used as a home office. The handwriting was hers, the familiar rightward lean, slightly more careful than her everyday script, the way she wrote when she wanted to be precise. She had written it 8 months ago in February, 3 months after she received Daniel's plan, and 2 months after she had finished converting the trust. She had not told me she was writing it. She had written it on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the shop, and then she had sealed it and driven it to Alan's office herself. I know this because she said so in the first paragraph. She wrote that she was sorry for the secrecy. She said it was the hardest kind of decision to make, not the legal arrangements which Alan had made straightforward, but the decision to carry the knowledge alone for however many months she had left. She said she had asked herself every week whether she was protecting me or simply avoiding a conversation she did not have the energy for, and that the honest answer was probably both. She wrote about Daniel. She said she had loved him without reservation for 38 years, and that nothing in his plan had changed, that which was the most difficult part. She said that what Daniel had done was not the act of a cruel person, but the act of a person who had stopped seeing clearly, who had looked at his parents and seen a problem to be managed rather than people to be known. She said she recognized it because she had watched it develop slowly, the way a tree grows into a fence, so gradually you only notice it has happened when the damage is already done. Then she wrote the line that stopped me. I don't want to leave you my anger along with my money. I want to leave you time. I set the page down on the table and pressed my hands flat on either side of it. She had written that she did not know what Richard Hayes would do with the time she was giving him. She said she suspected he would be patient longer than was good for him, and then do exactly the right thing because that was who he was, and that she hoped he would do the right thing a little faster than his nature inclined him to because she would not be there to nudge him along. That was Linda. Even in a letter written from the edge of her life, she could not resist a gentle, accurate criticism delivered with enough warmth that it felt like being held rather than corrected. She wrote about the shop. She said the woodworking shop on Fruitridge Road was not an asset or a liability or a line item in anyone's financial plan. It was the place where Richard Hayes was most himself, and she was asking him, not telling him, asking to go back to it. She said Tommy Briggs had called her twice during her illness, just to ask how she was doing, which she found more touching than she had let on to either of us, and that a man who had that kind of loyalty deserved to keep his job. The last paragraph was short. She wrote, "I have loved you since I was 24 years old. I expect to keep doing it from wherever I end up, which I suspect is not as far as it seems from where you are sitting. Take care of Hector. Finish the jewelry box. Go back to the shop." She signed it the way she signed birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes she used to leave on my workbench, Linda. Just her name. As though there were only one person in the world it could refer to, and she trusted me to know that. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. Then I picked up my phone and sent Tommy a text message. 7 words. Opening the shop Monday. Be there at 6. I set the phone down and picked up my tea. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway, the way you finish things that have gone cold, because the finishing matters more than the temperature. And I looked out the kitchen window at the October dark and talked to Linda the way I had been talking to her all week, not out loud, not in words exactly, but in the particular interior language of people who have known each other long enough that full sentences are sometimes more than the moment requires. I told her I understood. I told her she had been right about most of it. I told her I was going to need a little more time before I did the thing that needed doing next, and that I hoped wherever she was not too impatient about it. Before I reveal the 3 hidden documents that completely shattered their plan, type justice or drop the number 1 in the comments right now. So I know you're still listening with me on Dad's Revenge Stories, and please note the following part includes dramatized fictional elements that may not reflect actual events. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to close this video right here. Not an invitation, exactly, more an announcement. I said 7 o'clock, I said bring Jessica. I said I had been thinking about things and wanted to talk. He was quiet on the phone for a moment in the way he had been quiet about certain things lately, a new kind of quiet, less strategic than before, more like a man genuinely uncertain of the ground beneath him. He said they would be there. I spent most of that day cooking. I made the pot roast Linda had always made for serious occasions, the kind of meal that took the whole afternoon, that filled the house with the smell of rosemary and slow-cooked beef and the particular warmth of an oven that has been running since 2 in the afternoon. I set the table properly the way Linda had taught me, with the good placemats and the water glasses and the cloth napkins she kept in the second drawer. I put candles on the table. I was not sure why I did that exactly, except that Linda had always believed that a table with candles communicated something important about the seriousness of the people sitting at it. At 6:45, I went to the bedroom and took 3 things from the places I had been keeping them. From Linda's drawer in the kitchen, the authorization form with the forged signature returned by Jason Mercer 16 days ago. From the interior pocket of my serious jacket, the hospital emergency contact form folded once along the crease I had made in the Mercy General parking structure. And from the shelf above the desk in Linda's home office, the Hayes Family Retirement and Asset Plan, 6 pages stapled in the upper left corner. Daniel R. Hayes, December 3, 2024. I set all 3 face down on the kitchen counter. Then I went back to the dining room and finished setting the table. Daniel and Jessica arrived at 7:03. Jessica had brought wine, which she set on the counter with the careful brightness she defaulted to in uncertain situations. Daniel looked around the kitchen the way a person looks around a room they have been in 1,000 times when something about it suddenly feels different. The candles, maybe, or the good placemats, or the particular quality of stillness that a house carries when the person who lived in it has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to say so. We sat down. I served the pot roast. We passed the bread. Jessica commented that the rosemary was perfect, which it was, because Linda had taught me that rosemary wants to go in early and be left alone. Daniel asked about the shop, which surprised me. It was the first time since Linda died that he had asked about the shop as something that mattered rather than something to be disposed of. I told him Tommy and I had gotten the big table saw recalibrated and that we had 2 new commissions coming in from a restaurant group in Midtown that wanted custom booth seating. For 20 minutes, it was almost like an ordinary dinner. Then I stood up, went to the kitchen counter, and came back with the 3 documents. I set them in the center of the table, still face down, and sat back down. Daniel looked at the stack of papers. Jessica looked at Daniel. "I want to show you some things," I said. "And I want us to talk about them like adults who are capable of honesty. That's all I'm asking." I turned over the first document, the Hayes Family Retirement and Asset Plan. 6 pages. I set it in front of Daniel and watched his face. He looked at the title. He looked at the date. He did not look up at me. "You sent this to your mother in December," I said. "While she was in her 3rd round of chemotherapy. You sent it to her email on a Wednesday afternoon, and you asked for her blessing." I kept my voice level. "She called Alan Porter the next morning." Daniel's jaw moved once. He did not speak. I turned over the second document. The emergency contact form from Mercy General. I set it in front of him so he could read the 11 words in the notes field. Jessica leaned forward to look, and I watched the color change in her face as she read it. "I picked up your mother's belongings from the hospital," I said. "They returned this with her things as a matter of policy." I waited. "Do you want to tell me when you changed it?" Daniel looked at the form. His throat moved. "Dad, after her second admission," I said. "I think. That was in July. She was in for 4 days for the reaction to the second-line treatment. You drove her in because I had a delivery that morning. I had worked this out over the past 9 days, going back through the calendar Linda had kept on the refrigerator. She was disoriented from the medication when she arrived. You would have had access to the intake forms. The candle between us moved in a draft from somewhere." Jessica put her wine glass down very carefully, as though she was concerned about the noise it might make. "I didn't think you'd need to know," Daniel said. His voice had gone thin, the way voices go when the explanation a person has been relying on collapses under its own weight before they can get it out. "I thought, if something happened fast, someone needed to be reachable who could make decisions," I said. "Instead of me." He closed his eyes. I turned over the 3rd document, the authorization form for the transfer of the woodworking shop, the page with the forged signature at the bottom. I set it on top of the other 2 and watched Daniel open his eyes and look at it. "Jason Mercer brought this to my door," I said. "He drove out here himself because he did not want to complete a transaction he was not certain was clean." I looked at my son across the candlelit table. He is a better man than the deal required him to be. The room was very quiet. Jessica made a sound, not a word, a sound the kind that comes from somewhere below speech. She pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the kitchen doorway, where she stood with her back to us and her hand pressed against the doorframe. Daniel was looking at the 3 documents stacked in front of him. His shoulders had dropped in the particular way shoulders drop when a person stops holding something up. His hands were on the table, palms flat, fingers slightly spread, the posture of someone who has run out of the energy required to keep their hands doing something purposeful. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. No explanation attached, no qualification trailing behind them, no pivot toward what comes next. Just the 2 words said to the table or to the documents or to some version of himself he was only now meeting. I looked at my son for a long moment. "I know," I said, and I did. I believed him. The believing did not resolve anything, did not unforge the signature or unchange the hospital form, or give Linda back the 8 months she had spent carrying this alone. But it was real, and real was what I had been waiting for since the morning I had found him in the kitchen in his sweatpants, 21 days and a lifetime ago. Jessica turned around in the doorway. Her face had done something complicated, and then resolved into something simpler and harder. She looked at Daniel, then at me. "I think," she said carefully, "that I should go home tonight." Daniel slept in the guest room that night. I heard him moving around up there long after midnight, the slow, restless circuit of a man who cannot find a comfortable position because the problem is not the mattress. I lay in my own bed and listened to the house hold both of us, and sometime before 3, I finally slept. In the morning, I called a locksmith. I did not tell Daniel first. I made coffee, I fed Hector, and then I called the number on a card that had been stuck to the inside of the junk drawer for 4 years, the same locksmith who had rekeyed the shop after a break-in attempt in 2021. He arrived at 9. He was efficient and quiet, and finished both the house and the side gate in under an hour. Daniel came downstairs while the locksmith was still working on the back door. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched without saying anything for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Both locks," he said. "Both locks," I said. "And the shop." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He did not argue. That surprised me more than anything else he had done in the past 3 weeks. More than the resignation, more than the promises, more than the forged signature. The absence of argument was new. It meant something, though I was not yet sure what. When the locksmith left, I set the new keys on the table. I kept one set. I did not slide the other across to Daniel. "The deposit on the Santa Barbara property," I said. "The penalty for breaking the hold that's on you. Not on your mother's estate. Not on me." Daniel looked at the keys on the table. His voice when it came was quieter than I had heard it in years. "I know," he said. "I know it is." Tommy was already at the gate when I pulled into the lot at 5:58. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his breath making small clouds in the December morning air, and when my headlights swept across him, he raised one hand in the particular way Tommy Briggs had been raising his hand in greeting for 27 years. Not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the gesture of a man who considers enthusiasm something to be rationed carefully and deployed only when it is genuinely meant. I unlocked the gate. We walked in together without saying much. The shop smelled the way it always smelled, sawdust and machine oil and the particular woody sweetness of stored lumber that I had never once in 35 years gotten tired of walking into. I hit the main switch. The overhead lights came on in sequence the way they always did the far bay last. Tommy stood in the middle of the floor and looked around at all of it. His jaw moved once. He turned away from me and walked to the big table saw and put both hands on the fence rail and stood there for a moment with his back to me and his shoulders doing something I pretended not to notice. 6 o'clock, he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Just like always." "Just like always," I said. At noon, Diane Kowalski brought lunch, her late husband Frank's thermos, filled with tomato soup, a sleeve of crackers, 2 cups. She sat with me on the loading dock in the thin December sun, and did not ask about Daniel or Jessica or the estate or any of it. She talked about Frank, and I talked about Linda, and we ate soup and watched a pair of sparrows argue over something in the parking lot. When she left, I went back inside and started cutting. Brandon arrived at 7:15 with syrup on his jacket, and a missing front tooth I had not seen yet. He came through the front door, the way 8-year-olds come through doors, at a speed that suggested the concept of entering a room gradually had simply never occurred to him. Daniel had dropped him at the curb without coming in. I had heard the car idle for a moment, then pull away, and I had noted it without judgment. There would be time for Daniel later. This morning belonged to someone else. Grandpa Brandon's boots were still half untied. He had clearly dressed himself in a hurry, one sock striped and one sock plain, his jacket zipped crooked. Dad said I could stay until lunch. Is that okay? He has to go do stuff. That's more than okay, I said and meant it. Take your boots off, buddy. I'm making pancakes. He kicked them off in the hallway, nearly toppling into the wall in the process, and thundered into the kitchen, where Hector had already positioned himself strategically beneath the table tail, thumping against the floor with the enthusiasm of a very old dog who understood with total clarity what pancakes meant for his own prospects that morning. I made a full batch buttermilk, the way Linda always made them, with a little extra vanilla folded in at the end, because she swore it made a difference, and I had never found a reason to argue with her about it. Brandon ate 4 syrup dripping down his chin, chattering about a video game and a kid at school named Tyler, who apparently could not be trusted with a soccer ball, and he fed the crusty edges of a 5th pancake to Hector under the table when he thought I was not watching. I was watching. I let it go. After breakfast, while Brandon was still wiping syrup off his hands with a paper towel that was doing very little good, I got up from the table and walked to the hall closet. The box had been sitting on the top shelf for 4 days, wrapped in brown paper, because I did not own wrapping paper with anything more festive on it, tied with a length of the same twine I used in the shop to bundle offcuts. I carried it back to the kitchen table and set it down in front of him. Brandon looked at it, then at me, his eyes going wide in the particular way an 8-year-old's eyes go wide when they sense that something has been made specifically for them, which is a different kind of gift entirely from something bought. "Open it," I said. He tore through the brown paper without ceremony. No careful unwrapping, no saving the paper, just the pure enthusiasm of a child who understands instinctively that presents are meant to be gotten into. Inside the box, nested in a bed of tissue paper, was the truck. White oak, 8 inches long, the cab shaped over 3 long evenings in the shop, with a spokeshave and a set of rasps I had owned since before his father was born. The wheels were hand-turned on the lathe from a scrap of maple I had been saving for something, though I had not known what until now. I had applied 2 coats of a natural beeswax finish, the kind safe enough for a child to put in his mouth if he still did that sort of thing, and it smelled faintly of honey when you held it close. Brandon lifted it out of the tissue paper with both hands, the way you lift something you already understand. Is fragile and important. Though nothing about a solid oak truck was actually fragile at all, he turned it over slowly. He ran his thumb along the curve of the front wheel, feeling the place where I had sanded it down to nothing but smoothness. And then he looked at the grain running through the cab, the way the lines moved and darkened and caught the light, with the same careful, deliberate attention I had taught him on the Saturday afternoons. He used to sit on the stool beside my workbench, small enough then that his feet did not reach the floor, asking why the wood did that, why it curved like that, why some pieces were darker than others. "You made this," he said. Not a question. A boy confirming something he already knew to be true. "I made it," I said. "Every piece of it." He looked up at me, and for one full breath I was not looking at Brandon at all. I was looking at Linda, the same clear, unhurried attention she gave to anything she had decided, mattered the same steady brown eyes that had looked at me across 100 kitchen tables over 42 years, and never once needed to perform anything to be understood. "It's the best thing I ever got," Brandon said. I put my hand on top of his head the way I used to do to Daniel when he was small enough for it to still work as reassurance rather than an old man's habit, and I let it stay there for a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. Outside, the December sun had climbed just high enough to come through the kitchen window at a low winter angle, the particular unhurried light Sacramento gets in the last week of the year, laying itself across the floor in a long, clean line that reached almost to the table leg. I thought about Linda. I thought about 42 years, and a trust quietly drawn up in February, while I sat oblivious in a shop full of sawdust, and a letter that had told me in her own careful handwriting to go back to the thing that made me myself. I thought about Tommy at the table saw on that first morning back, his shoulders doing something he would never have admitted to if I had asked him about it directly. I thought about Margaret driving 2.5 hours down Highway 99 on a Saturday morning, because the right thing once she saw it clearly required nothing less than the drive. And I thought about this, a boy with a hand-carved truck and his grandmother's eyes sitting at a kitchen table that still somehow knew the both of us on a morning that was ordinary in every single way that actually mattered. That was enough. I finally understood exactly what Linda had meant it to be. There is a grandpa story I never wanted to have. But here it is anyway. I spent 42 years building a life with a woman who was smarter than me in the ways that mattered most. She saw what was coming before I did. She bought me time instead of leaving me anger. And because of her, I got to choose who I wanted to be when everything fell apart. Here is what I believe now as a man who has sat in a kitchen alone and read a letter from someone who loved him past the end of her own life. Love does not mean giving people everything they want. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make them earn what comes next. God has a way of putting the right letter in the right drawer at the right moment. I have stopped being surprised by that. This is a family story about a father who waited too long to draw a line. Do not be me. Draw it earlier. Draw it kindly. But draw it. If any part of this grandpa story stayed with you, if any part of this family story felt familiar in a way you did not expect, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who might need it. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, consider staying with us. There are more waiting. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements, crafted purely with the heart, and with the hope that something in them finds you at exactly the right moment. If that is not what you are looking for today, that is completely all right. There is something out there made just for you. Go find it.